So last time we had started discussing the historical merits of the biblical stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and these are contained in Genesis 12 through 50. And scholarly opinion on this matter is seriously divided, something you need to know. Some scholars will point to internal biblical evidence for the authenticity and the antiquity of the patriarchal stories. So, for example, Nachum Sarna argues that representing Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as foreigners and strangers in Canaan is hardly a convenient tradition for a people who are seeking to establish their claim to its homeland. And if this myth of origins were the fabrication of a later writer, then surely they would have written the story in such a way as to give their ancestors a less tenuous hold or connection to the land. He also notes that some of the material in the patriarchal stories would be offensive to later religious sensibilities. Jacob is married to two sisters simultaneously. That is something that is explicitly forbidden in the book of Deuteronomy. So why wouldn't a later writer have cleaned up this ancestral record if this were in fact something composed at a later period? Also, he notes that the representation of interethnic relationships in the patriarchal stories do not accord with the reality of a later period. So, for example, the Arameans are considered close kin to the Israelites. A wandering Aramean was my father, it says. Spouses are always chosen, daughters for sons are always chosen by going back to the Aramean people and choosing someone from close kin. But in the period of the monarchy, right, so that's going to be after 1000, in the period of the monarchy, there were very poor relations with the Arameans. They were bitter enemies. So why, according to scholars like Sarna, would a biblical author from that period portray the Arameans as close kin, unless they had some older established tradition that reflected that fact? So Sarna and other scholars hold that the patriarchal traditions are not entirely fabricated retrojections from a later period. They contain authentic memories of an earlier historic situation. The patriarchs, it's maintained, were semi-nomads. They lived in tents. From time to time, they wandered to Egypt or Mesopotamia, often in search of pasture for their animals. And various details of their language, their customs, their laws, their religion, it's argued, seem to fit well into the period of the late Bronze Age. I've given you the periods at the top of the chart. Early Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, from about 2100 to 1550. We date the Late Bronze Age from about 1550 until 1200, with the introduction of iron and the beginning of the Iron Age in 1200. Prior to that, the Bronze Age, which is divided into these three periods. So that's, on the one hand, scholars who see these stories as reflecting historical memories and having a certain authenticity to them. Then on the other hand, at the other extreme, you have scholars who see the patriarchal stories as entirely fabricated retrojections of a much later age, and they varied significantly as to when they think these stories were written, anywhere from the period of the monarchy all the way down to the 4th century, some of them. Works published in the 1970s by authors like Thomas Thompson, John Van Seters, take the position that these stories are filled with anachronisms, their chronologies are confused. These anachronisms and confused chronologies in the patriarchal stories are the rule rather than the exception in their view, and they are evidence of a very late date of composition. So you have these two extremes based on the internal evidence of the Bible itself, but you also have the same two extreme positions reflected in the discipline of archaeology. In the early days, archaeology of the region tended toward credulity, and it was explicitly referred to as biblical archaeology, an interesting name because it suggests that the archaeologists were out there searching for evidence that would verify the details of the biblical text. We're doing biblical archaeology, archaeology in support of the biblical text. I mentioned last time William F. Albright, an American archaeologist. He believed strongly that archaeological findings were important external evidence for the basic historicity and authenticity of, for example, the patriarchal stories. And certainly some archaeological findings were quite remarkable. Scholars of the Albright School pointed to texts and clay tablets that were discovered in 2nd millennium sites. So you see down the bottom, 2nd millennium BC, obviously going down to 1000, 1st millennium 1000 to 0. And the 2nd millennium really wasn't longer than the 1st millennium, it's just that I ran out of board. But specifically, sites like Nuzi and Mari, I've placed them in their approximate places on the timeline. Nuzi and Mari were sites that are near the area that's identified in the Bible as being the ancestral home of the patriarchs in Mesopotamia, or on the highway from there to Canaan. And these texts and clay tablets were believed to illuminate many biblical customs and institutions. So, in the Nuzi texts, which are from about the middle of the second millennium, we learn of the custom of adoption for purposes of inheritance, particularly the adoption of a slave in the absence of offspring. And biblical scholars got very excited about this. They point to the biblical passage in which Abraham expresses to God his fear that his servant Eliezer will have to be the one to inherit God's promise because Abraham has no son. Also, according to the Nuzi texts, if a wife is barren, she is to provide a maidservant as a substitute to bear her husband's children. And this is something that happens with 3 out of the 4 matriarchs who are afflicted with infertility: Sarah, Rachel, and Leah. There are other parallels in family and marriage law that correlate with certain biblical details. In the 18th century, the texts from Mari, they contain names that correspond to Israelite names: Benjamin, Laban, Ishmael. So biblical scholars, buoyed up by these correlations between the archaeological finds, the texts found by archaeologists, and biblical stories, asserted that the patriarchs were real persons, and their customs and their legal practices and their social institutions could be verified against the backdrop of the second millennium as revealed by archaeological findings. However, it's been argued that some of these ancient sources have been misread or misinterpreted in an effort to find parallels with biblical institutions. A lot of gap filling is going on to make these texts look as though they correspond to biblical institutions. And skeptics like Thomas Thompson and John Van Seters point out that many of the biblical customs which are paralleled in ancient Near Eastern sources were still alive and well down in the first millennium. So references to these customs in the patriarchal stories really doesn't tell us anything about dating. They could derive from anywhere in the second or first millennium. And for other reasons, they think it is much more reasonable to date the composition of these stories to the first millennium, in some cases quite late first millennium. Furthermore, over time, many discrepancies between the archaeological record and the biblical text became apparent. And increasingly, practitioners of what was now being termed Palestinian archaeology or ancient Near Eastern archaeology or archaeology of the Levant, rather than biblical archaeology, some of these archaeologists grew disinterested in pointing out the correlations between the archaeological data and the biblical stories, or trying to explain away any discrepancies in order to keep the biblical text intact. And they began to focus on the best possible reconstruction of the history of the region on the basis of the archaeological evidence, regardless of whether or not those results would confirm the biblical text, the biblical account. And in fact, this reconstruction often does contradict biblical claims. We're going to see this quite clearly in a few weeks when we consider the book of Joshua and its story of Israel's lightning invasion of the land of Canaan. The archaeological record just doesn't support such a story. Still, many people have clung to the idea of the Bible as a historically accurate document, many times out of ideological necessity. Many fear that if the historical information in the Bible isn't true, then the Bible is unreliable as a source of religious instruction or inspiration. And that's something they don't want to give up. And this is all really a very unfortunate and heavy burden to place on this fascinating little library of writings from late antiquity. People who equate truth with historical fact will certainly end up viewing the Bible dismissively as a naive and unsophisticated web of lies, since it is replete with elements that cannot be literally true. But to view it this way is to make a genre mistake. Shakespeare's Hamlet, while set in Denmark, an actual place, is not historical fact. But that doesn't make it a naive and unsophisticated web of lies, because we accept when we read or watch Hamlet that it is not a work of historiography, a work of writing about history. It is a work of literature. And in deference to that genre and its conventions, we know and accept that the truths it conveys are not those of historical fact, but are social, political, ethical, existential truths. and the Bible deserves at least the same courteous attention to its genre. The Bible doesn't pretend to be, and it shouldn't be read as what we would call objective history. And to see the scare quotes, you should be looking up there so you see the scare quotes. Objective history. In other words, perhaps a bare narration of events. To be sure, we do find that some events that are mentioned in the biblical text correlate to events that we know of from sources outside the Bible. So, for example, Pharaoh Shishak's invasion of Palestine in 924. This is mentioned in the biblical text. It's mentioned in the Egyptian sources. There's a nice correlation. The destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. The capture of Jerusalem in 597. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586. These are all recorded in the biblical text, and they are in Assyrian and Babylonian records as well as other events from the period of the monarchy. So as a result, because of these correlations, many scholars are willing to accept the general biblical chronology of the period from the monarchy on. Starting about 1000 on, they accept that general chronology, the sequence of kings and battles and so on. But ultimately, it is a mistake, I think, to read the Bible as a historical record. The Bible is literature. Its composition is influenced and determined by literary conventions and goals. Now, of course, we all know that there is no such thing as purely objective history anyway. We have no direct access to past events. We only ever have mediated access in material archaeological remains that yield information to us only after a process of interpretation, or in texts that are themselves already an interpretation of events and must still be interpreted by us. The biblical narrative is an interpretation of events that were held by centuries-long tradition to be meaningful in the life of the people. And to the biblical narrators, these events, known perhaps from ancient oral traditions, pointed to a divine purpose. And the narrative is told to illustrate that basic proposition. The biblical narrators are not trying to write history as a modern historian might try to write history. They are concerned to show us what they believe to be the finger of God in the events and experiences of the Israelite people. One scholar, Mark Brettler, whose name I've also put up here, Mark Brettler notes that in the Bible, the past is refracted through a theological lens, if not a partisan political ideological lens. But then all ancient historical narrative is written that way, and one could argue all contemporary historical narrative is written that way. With due caution, we can still learn things from texts, ancient and modern. We can still learn things about Israel's history from the biblical sources, just as classical historians have learned a great deal about classical history, Greece and Rome, despite or through the tendentious, partisan, and ideologically motivated writings of classical writers. So our discussion of the patriarchal stories is going to bear all of these considerations in mind. We're not going to be asking whether these stories are historically accurate. I'm going to assume they are not. And once we rid ourselves of the burden of historicity, we're free to appreciate the stories for what they are. Powerful, powerful narratives that must be read against the literary conventions of their time, and whose truths are social, political, moral, and existential.